Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, over here in the good old US of A, we are 1 week away from what has been just an absolutely atrocious election cycle for the presidency of the United States. And couple this with not just what we talked about yesterday with Georgia, but many elections and events that have been going on in Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe. I'll tell you what, the West is falling apart, and they're doing everything in their power to try to keep the status quo from turning over to the populace. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And yeah, I mean, from lawfare to assassination attempts to congressmen saying they're not going to confirm, this is just becoming, forgive my French, a shit show.
Well, sometimes it's the only adjective that suffices. So yes, I mean, obviously, thanks for joining me as well, Ken. Yeah, I mean, I'll let you lead on developments in the US, but what I will say just briefly is, I mean, the last two US elections were very poisonous. At first, we had the 2016 election when Trump got elected, and then the 2020 with Biden, and here we are 4 years later, and Trump's up against Harris, and the vitriolic nature of it is just a sight to be seen. But unfortunately, this is how polarized the United States has become, when sadly, people should realize that, as with all Western countries, traditional political parties, basically, it doesn't matter which side of the fence they're on, they make the same policy decisions. And we did, a podcast not that long ago saying, look, the outcome of the election is not going to change things economically, etc. And we're not here to repeat that, but this is more to focus on the election itself, as Ken says, because it's only now a week away.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I'll focus on the U.S. side, and definitely you got a little bit more insight what's going on in regards to Germany, the AfD party, France, Macron keeping a legitimate government coalition from coming together, etc. But the fascinating thing has been, of course, when the establishment, I'm talking about whether the intelligence agencies writing up false reports, candidates claiming Russia involvement and interference, bringing in Kamala. Her campaign is bringing in members of the UK Labour Party to go door to door. This is just blown up into something that I don't think Americans have seen in any capacity going back to probably the 19th century. And I don't want to emphasize that today is anything new. Obviously, elections led to a civil war in the 1860s because of one side being pro-slavery, one side being anti-slavery, and the like. And today, it's almost like, because the U.S. has become empirical after World War II, and for all intents and purposes, there's never been really a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. It's been a uniparty. There have been candidates and representatives from certain states that don't side with, and they go against that, but they've been few and far between. You take a look at most candidates. We are for all intents and purposes, a two-party system, which makes it so much easier for the establishment and the controlling portions of the government to say, you have a choice, but your choice is one of our candidates that we fund and pay for, that, it doesn't matter who wins, we still control them. Honestly, I think the problem is that with the JFKs of the world back in 1960, the Trumps of the world, when they aren't part of that system and that establishment, it is an absolute threat to everything that they hold. And so in this election, because of social media, because of 24-hour news cycles, because we have the opportunity to see coast to coast what exactly is going on. The amount of attacks on a single candidate, the amount of rhetoric and propaganda and outward lies that are especially being exposed, is just mind-blowing. And you have to wonder at a certain point if it's just too much information overload, because the election cycle, where an election for, say, 2024, it really begins in 2022, if not immediately after the previous election. And people are just hit with so much stuff. How can you really make a good decision in that capacity? So, when you also have where the country has really, and I want to give this a shout out, there are more claimed independents in the United States today than there ever has been. It's approximately 35% that are staunch Republicans. They'll vote Republican pretty much no matter what. 30 to 35% Democrats who will vote even, if it's Hillary, if it's Joe Biden in the basement, or if it's cackling Kamala, it doesn't matter. But there's, what's that? That leaves 35 to 40% of independents who have become independent because they want to critically think. They want to make independent choices. They don't want to be tied to a certain party where their family, or where, in the case we saw over the weekend, Barack Obama comes out and says, if you don't vote for so and so, you're a misogynist. They're starting to think for themselves. And I think this is all going back to that rising populist frequency shift that occurs in the world about every second and third decade of a particular century. And it's not just the US, of course, it's what we have in Europe. Now, the thing about it is if Trump takes over, yes, he has a track record of wanting to try to make peace rather than war. So that's a benefit. But the problem is now is that there's already a number of conflicts that are well into fruition, and it's going to be extraordinarily hard to try to stop the momentum of where they're going. Whether he's able to do that on his own, whether he's able to do that by getting Europe in line and to stop funding and helping and aiding in this, I don't know. I can't say. Chances are maybe 50-50 or 40-60, but as we talked about before in a previous podcast, the bit has, the horse has the bit in his mouth in regards to what the economy, the financial system, the banking system is at. And really, there's nothing that can be done to stop it. And when the US starts losing financial control of the world, they start losing military control and then thus hegemonic control.
Yeah, I mean, for me, looking in from the outside in the US, I mean, okay, it's anyone who knows me knows I've never voted in elections. I don't bother voting. I see them as a pointless waste of time because it doesn't matter who you vote for. But there's an argument, and I made this point. The fact you have a choice between Trump and Harris is, for me, is indicative of the fact of just how bad US politics has become. And people from one side or the other won't like me saying that, but I'm not sure Trump's really has the capability to be president. And I'm not saying he doesn't have the intention to want to do things, but it didn't work last time. So why is it going to be different this time? Now, somebody would say, well, arguably things are different this time. He's going to be wiser. And now, okay, that might be true, and time will tell whether that comes to pass. But I would say if there was someone who was properly presidential and an independent candidate now, I would think they'd probably win. That candidate doesn't exist, and it's not going to happen. But I think the problem in the US, because of the nature of the candidates, is created so much of a polarized perspective. And the fear is whoever wins, there's still going to be the risk of turmoil in the country. I mean, there's already mutterings and with the fact that if Trump gets elected, well, who knows what the consequences and outcome might be. And we're not here to make wild speculation, which adds nothing to the debate. But I would say there is a risk that there's going to be claims the election was rigged, and there might end up being some potentially serious problems because of the nature of how polarized the country's become. I mean, of course, traditionally in Western countries, they want to have people polarized, and they get them to vote for different parties and claim then that it's a democracy when it isn't. But you can push that point too far, and I think the US has pushed it too far. And I mean, there's been so many claims already about the risk of vote rigging, the ballots being, filled in by dead people, and et cetera, et cetera. And we had a lot of claims in 2020. We're not going back to that again, but the risk is that there is certainly already evidence of people trying to tamper with the end result. And to be honest, how the US election process works for me is absolutely farcical in terms of voting. I mean, all this voting happening now, the length of time it takes for them to get the results in certain states is extremely concerning. And I think at some point the whole system needs to be overhauled to ensure at some point in the future you do have a what I would call a completely fair election. But I think the risk is whatever the result is going to cause some degree of problems pending whatever the outcome is going to be. And what happens with US foreign policy at this point, or domestic policy, really is irrelevant, because the US is already in terminal decline as an hegemonic power. It's already, the dollar is increasingly not behaving as a world reserve currency. Also, the United States' reputation in the world has suffered a huge amount of damage because of Ukraine and because of them supporting Israel. So the US is incredibly weak now. And the timing of the election is arguably couldn't be a worse time. And therefore, the question is, to what extent would a Trump presidency cause enormous problems? And to what extent would Harris being elected cause enormous problems? I mean, I'm not here to make judgments about the outcome, but what I would say is, from my perspective, is if you have a choice of Trump and Harris, there's only one choice, and that's Trump. That's whether you even think Trump's capable of being the president. But compared to Harris, he's infinitely a better choice. But that's all relative. So I think the US, it poses enormous problems, and you just fear that there's going to be elements in there who are being very happy to stomp around the world and be disruptive outside the United States to achieve aims. The risk is that could potentially happen internally after this election, particularly if Trump is elected, because it's not just domestically. The issue then is, what's Trump going to do? Is Europe's going to panic because they think he'll pull out of NATO, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really, really problematic situation that the US faces. But this is what happens if you make polarization to the point of absurdity. You risk creating huge problems when one side gets elected as opposed to the other. Because if you go back in history in US elections, one side won, everybody shook hands and went, well, congratulations, and the country moved on. Well, that's not been the case since Trump was elected in 2016. And the bitterness, the rivalry, and just frankly, the kind of just toxic environment that surrounds US politics is getting worse and worse. And for me, it's now they've gone, it's basically a bridge too far.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because, I see elections, and really this is, pardon me, what the founding fathers saw. One, obviously women couldn't vote for a long time. That, some things just take time, because the era that the founding fathers created this country, most of Europe was under monarchies, and there wasn't a thing called a vote anyway, so who cared? But the reality is that you need an educated electorate. Well, we don't have that. We have an indoctrinated and, for most part, programmed electorate. The other thing is they've been able to change what voting really is about. In the 1950s, leading in the 1960s, voting was a duty and a responsibility, a combination of both. Okay, you didn't have to do registrations up to the very last day. You didn't have to bring in, you didn't have to make claims that, oh, getting an ID is too hard for people. If somebody wants to vote, they will do what is necessary to register, to get an ID, and to vote. It's not rocket science. You shouldn't make something as easy as getting a prize out of a box of Cracker Jack when it's as important as electing the officials to represent you for the next 2 to 4 years, 2 to 6 years, depending on what office it is. You should study the individual, study the policies and what the items of the day are, and then make a educated a vote. Now it's getting to the point that they're going to court to say that illegal immigrants coming in can vote, and people who did this, felons can vote, and all of this stuff to try to, that's, to tell the truth, that is exactly what democracy is. Aristotle once said, democracy is one step above from anarchy. The vast majority of people are uneducated and they're easily swayed, and you could get them to put anybody in power you want. Well, the more voters that you have under your control and dominion, it's much easier to do this. You see this locally back in the 19th century in what was known as Tammany Hall in New York. As all these immigrants were coming over from Europe, they had what were called patrons over each of the different, the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, the Russians. They all had their patrons. Well, the patrons answered to Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall there in New York. And those patrons would tell these new immigrants who to vote for. So they had a controlled machine. You see this in the 50s, Mayor Daley. So you're right about U.S. politics. Even though it's a national election, all politics is local, and it's usually controlled by the local machines. Now, more importantly, what you were saying and what we are seeing happen in Europe. I mean, go back to the Brexit vote. Right, I think the very night before the Brexit vote, one of the PMs, she was walking randomly in a market and somebody attacked her. The amount of individuals willing to do what others, NGOs, protesters, or whatever their ideology, whatever people are willing to do, are going to lead to, violent outbursts, protests, and even, things worse. And we saw this in 2016. We saw this, of course, in between then and the 2020 election, BLM, Antifa, etc. What's going to happen now? Because if you think there's 10,000 NGOs that are in Georgia, how many do you think are the United States?
Yeah, and it's a huge one. But and this is a question I've often sort of put to American friends, and I've said, you have a two-party state, and the way the governance structure is, it's impossible for anyone else to break in. There is historical precedence. Ross Perot tried to do it and couldn't succeed. I think he probably got the closest, but typically it's that nailed down. And the way the system is, you need enormous sums of money, which I frankly think is absurd. That you, particularly in the modern era, that you need huge sums of money and all that, and spend enormous amounts on your election campaign, which makes it prohibitive for a third party or fourth party to break in to the US electoral system, which is something other countries, like in Europe, arguably in the UK, it's even possible. We've seen not a definitive success in that regard, but we have seen other alternative parties who may increasingly become more influential in these countries. But in the US, you're looking, going, if you need an alternative, how is it going to ever happen? And I'll be interested, and I'm sure the listeners will, to get your perspective on where do you see the light, or what's the likelihood of that ever happening in the future? Because I think a credible alternative now is really something the United States needs.
Really fascinating, because the only time I would see that happening is if we have, I don't want to say a civil war, but definitely a societal breakdown in the United States where things become more regional than national. And then maybe at that point, we won't even have third political parties, or political parties to begin with. But on that note, I think something important, we've talked about some of the negative aspects, and we're not here telling people to vote for A, vote for B, whatever. We're trying to lay out the environment that the United States, that Western Europe, that even Eastern Europe is in right now, as the people are trying to vote politicians that will answer some of the problems and maybe help resolve, or try to start resolving some of the problems that go back 40, 50, 60, even 70 years, or back to the end of World War II. The one thing Trump has done he's brought together people from different ideologies and different political parties. RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, who's apolitical, or at least says he's apolitical. A lot of these, Vivek Ramaswamy, I forget his last name, Ramsworthy or something like that, bringing in different people who are not part of the establishment that are intending to be part of the administration should he win, that have new ideas and are not tied to the unipolar and the establishment system. That can be a start, because I think somebody like RFK would, and my guess is he's got Trump's ear, will start bringing in the potential and the possibility of opening up to new political parties, if not at least new ideas within the two ruling parties that are there, that they aren't beholden to the establishment like the Schumers and the McConnells and those who have run the parties for the last 30, 40, 50 years. If we get new people, new ideas, what we're seeing is, during Reagan, Reagan brought in a bunch of Democrats. They were called Blue Dog Democrats. The Democrats who were conservative, who no longer found themselves in, the Democratic Party, to them had moved away. So they became Republican. Now, the Republicans, known as neocons, the MAGA, the Tea Party, these movements within the Republican Party are, for all intents and purposes, a third party. They're a different party within the party, and they're trying to make change from within the party, rather than doing as a separate independent thing. Because if you don't have media support, if you don't have popular support, and if you don't have the money, because most of the elections in the US now are pretty much funded by billionaires and corporations, that's where all the money is. If you don't have that support, you're not going to get anywhere. So potentially you can build coalitions within a particular party, and eventually over time, you change that party to something more that the people want. And guess what? You start bringing in the RFKs, the Tulsi Gabbards, etc.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, and it's something that could materialize in the future. I mean, just some small points about Europe. I mean, let's take the UK. The UK got sick and tired of the Conservative Party, and they got trounced in the last general election. Labour Party won with a big majority, but already Starmer's deeply unpopular. And the question is, how long is the government going to survive? Can it last 5 years? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe an early election will get forced. Well, who are people going to vote for next time? They're going to go, well, Labour's failed. Do we want the Conservatives back? No. Then for want of a better word, populist party might have a chance, at least, of holding the balance of power. They might not win outright, But they're an interesting case in point. You mentioned Germany and the so-called traffic light coalition government's a complete failure. I mean, there's kind of rumors that the government hasn't collapsed, but internally it's totally fallen apart, which could well be true. So what happens in the next election? I mean, does one of the more traditional mainstream parties who isn't part of the coalition get back in? You mentioned the AfD and all the concerns because they have rising popularity. Maybe if Germany's economy continues to tank and crater, which it is, and then maybe they could become a more serious threat to the traditional vote in Germany. I mean, I guess there are rumors of them trying to outlaw the party. That's how fearful they are. So Germany's another example of this. France, I mean, the election was a farce. I mean, they basically, Macron shoehorned in a prime minister he knew would be sympathetic and not rock the boat. But Macron's got 3 years left as president. I don't see him being re-elected. And, again, the political structure of that country is changing. Whether that means Le Pen gets voted in the future, I don't know, but it depends on a whole bunch of factors, not least what happens economically, what happens financially across Europe. And so there is a lot of potential change coming in countries. And also people might look at Meloni getting elected and go, well, that hasn't exactly turned out how we hoped it would. And we obviously, as you said, to me probably before we came on, Fico was an attempted assassination of him in Slovakia. Also, Orban's not very popular with the West because he actually, ignores sanctions. He's in the European Union, but very much still very interested in the sovereign status of his country. Now, if people like Orban manages to be more successful, that may embolden other countries in Europe to do likewise. So the risk of big political change in Europe in the coming 5 years is quite feasible, and realistically only takes 1 or 2 major countries to vote someone in differently. Again, we're back to what's the establishment's view going to be in Brussels if a party gets elected with an outright majority that says we're leaving the European Union or we're going to leave NATO. And you imagine the fallout of this, and that would then could cascade into something far greater, because European countries might go, well, the people voted for this, and now you're telling them they can't have this. So they're in a very, very difficult situation, because sort of the whole neoliberal kind of agenda, or the neoliberal movement, whatever you want to call it, is falling apart. People are seeing the absurdity of it. And, there's, I say, elections coming up, the economy is cratering, the financial system's precarious, societally people are struggling, and they're only going to continue to get worse and worse in terms of their standard of living. And what happens in Germany is more and more companies, people lose their jobs, and then, you get this cascading effect across Europe as well. So this could cause a huge political change, this tsunami of change. And then countries might go, we're going to be sovereign again. And then the European Union folds, and okay, we're probably getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but you can see what's really is deeply fearful scenarios that now finally Brussels and the European Commission's beginning to take seriously. What they say publicly is irrelevant, but privately they're very, very worried, and particularly worried, as we said many times before, about the fallout of the Ukraine war, what that will do for NATO, what that will do for European countries, and what a Trump win in the US presidentials might do for US or European relations. So there are many things in the melting pot, and this could create enormous changes that the Western establishment, the Western empire, which is cratering and collapsing anyway, just doesn't want to see happen. But they're going to have no control over this, because, again, if you start meddling to such an extent that everybody inside European countries go, hang on a minute, this isn't a democracy anymore, then you have huge problems.
Yeah, I think more than anything, people need to realize that when something has been embedded almost to the point of petrified, a system, political system, change is not easy. Change is going to be hard. Change is going to have all types of chaos. And the hope, of course, is that at the end of the tunnel, you're going to see a better opportunity. The problem is that for the most part, things are temporary. You might have a new change that gets you in the short term and the medium term to something better, but uh, offices and governments are still run by people, and people over time, the good ones, the benevolent ones, go away, and new ones that just want political power and wealth and the ability to rule over others take their place. And it requires everybody to be diligent all the time. That's why voting, the opportunity to vote, the freedom to vote, is so important, because it's not something that all of a sudden you have to come, oh, it's November of 2024, it's time to vote. No, it's paying attention to all the things in between those 4 years when a president is elected, when your local governments and mayor's offices and that are being elected. You have to always stay on top of it, or if you just let yourself get pulled down by the things of the world, your daily living, all of a sudden you'll find you're being ruled by people you definitely didn't want to be there, and who have not your best interests at heart. Anyway, Paul, I think we covered quite a bit today.
Yeah, that's a good point to stop. Yep.
I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
Yeah, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for being a part as well and for your support. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.